The ANC's electoral support dropped significantly after the 29th of May polls. This has been as a turning point for the oldest liberation movement in Africa. The party's loss of support follows that of other former liberation movements, which then took over governments in southern Africa. Joining us is Prof. Henning Melber, who's a professor in the political science department at the University of Pretoria. Prof, thank you so much for joining us this evening. As we saw with those election results following those 29 May elections, the ANC seemingly following in the footsteps of other liberation movements across the continent.
Yes, indeed. And good evening to you, Martha, and all listeners. Liberation movements who turned into governments did not really deliver as it was expected. And that's a history ranging from Algeria to Zimbabwe, from A to Z, so to say. And by the way, it's not only confined to the African continent. We see examples elsewhere too. So the shift from anti-colonial alliances to executing power actually was including something that the fight was against, the control and seizure of society for their own benefit. And I think the longer that took place, the more the electorate or the people in support of those liberation movements had reasons to become frustrated, especially when the shift of generations leads, like in South Africa, to a significant number of born frees who, in their perspective, have never been liberated. So they never owned a liberation movement any loyalty. So those former liberation movements as governments, they are measured against their delivery. And in one of your headlines, you just made reference to protests, which are a daily occurrence in South Africa, over the lack of service delivery. And this is what people in South Africa experienced since democracy was established.
Prof, do we find that, across the board, when we're talking about this, there's an excitement, when a liberation movement then comes into power, when we're looking at specifically the African continent as well, just to ask that question, even though there are, of course, liberation movements that have been successful in other parts of the world. Just looking at the African continent as well, considering that decolonization was starting to take place from the 1950s, around about 1975, and 1960 proved to be quite a pivotal year on the African continent, with many African nations gaining and fighting for that independence. What happens after then, after these liberation movements gain this power? Because if we have had some liberation movements in government as early as long time ago as the 1960s, Africa should be looking different right now, Prof, wouldn't you say?
It's one of the sad occurrences that we witness, that decolonization has been a very limited process of transition and transfer of power to new elites. And actually, decolonial societies still have the core of colonial asymmetric power structures. They are reproduced in the so-called post-colonial societies. And that was already witnessed and really sharply analyzed by Frantz Fanon in 1960-61, when he made reference to the West African cases of the late 1950s. And in his Wretched of the Earth, which is almost like a Bible, he has a chapter entitled The Pitfalls of National Consciousness, and he explains exactly those mechanisms who the former liberators turn into a new elite and reproduce a very similar obsession with power and control as those they were fighting against.
So almost like a bit of an assimilation. So as opposed to saying we don't want these powers that be because, of course, they're oppressive, it's actually a fight to become one of those powers too and be able to enjoy the luxuries that come with that role.
Indeed. And it actually is a reminder that one of the slogans of the struggle days, which was "A luta continua," turned into "The looting continues." We really are confronted with a situation where South Africa is still the most unequal country in the world. That means the division between the haves and the have-nots is the biggest in the world after 30 years of democracy under a former liberation movement. So people have reasons enough, looking at their material situation, to be extremely frustrated, confronted with state capture, with an elite which is guided by self-enrichment, at least certain large parts of it, and non-delivery to the ordinary people. And that is something which we witnessed in Namibia, we witnessed in Zimbabwe, in Angola, in Mozambique. The list goes on and on.
And as you're saying, Prof, as you're speaking, I'm just remembering also a book about the Kenyan whistleblower called It's Our Turn to Eat, which speaks to this as well, that, there's this kind of dire need to be able to be, there's a phrase also that's the best oppressors are those who've been oppressed. So for nations like South Africa, where we have a former liberation movement that is in governance as well, what lessons should they be learning in terms of not going along this road, even though it shows that they clearly have already started and are?
Martha, first of all, you make reference to Kenya. It is the latest example that there is a time bomb ticking. So far in South Africa, the turning point was the electorate. And interesting enough, to maybe end with a more positive note, the ANC is maybe the only liberation movement in power so far, which humbly has accepted the vote of the people and did not try to sabotage that, like many other liberation movements as governments. Zimbabwe is the most obvious example, but we've witnessed it in Angola and Mozambique as well, or in Algeria. So actually, South Africa has moved, as we speak, into a new chapter of democracy, which might set a new standard with a former liberation movement as democratic party willing to accept the democratic rules and maybe start to act in the best interest, not only for their own party functionaries, but for the ordinary people. If delivery will, as a result of this government, improve, it will create a win-win situation.
Professor Henning, you're mentioning as well the smooth transition in which we have gone from a one-party dominant state to a multi-party state, and how the ANC, to its credit, has not gone down the same road as its counterparts in the rest of the continent as well. What happens after a liberation movement dies a slow, painful death? Who leads? Who takes over after there? In our case right now, we are in a position where we've got coalition governments. But typically, what should happen ideally?
Well, you see, the one observation is that during the time of seizing political power, those former liberation movements are divided. Let's remind ourselves, there are 3 parties of the 4 biggest who all have their home in the ANC. It's not only the ANC, it's the MK and it's the EFF. So if you add them up, those who came from the ANC as the cradle are still having a 2/3 majority, only that they are divided over the policy. And that we witnessed in other liberation movements as governments as well, that factions are becoming into divisive policies, party splits, that the former broad movement is actually divided into smaller units, ideologically divided, by specific personal interests divided, and so on. So the challenge now is, in the particular case of South Africa, that the ANC, who remains the biggest party, is able to coordinate a new inter-party government. They call it national unity, no matter what name you give it. But the challenge is to execute control in a way which enhances delivery, which then would have the potential to give back credibility to the ANC. So if they manage to form that government with delivery to the ordinary people and improving their living conditions, they might have a chance to be measured again, not for their credits as liberation movement, but for their credits as a government which takes care of the ordinary people.
Professor, would you say that it is an option, perhaps, to say that liberation movements have their role, a very significant role to play in countries, particularly countries that have been oppressed? And once that project is successfully accomplished and gotten over, and we can get over that hurdle, that liberation movements then should not be the ones to go into government, that then it should be moved over to a different sphere of society, and that this is your role is to liberate, and then let's get in a new crop of people to come in to govern.
Not necessarily a new crop, Martha, but your observation is spot on. The former liberators cannot continue to play a heroic narrative of yesteryear. They are not there to fight a struggle against an oppressive minority regime. They are now the regime, and they have to change their militaristic mindset. They are taking an oath to serve the best interest of the people. And that means not to serve their own power interests. And we could witness it in the early years of the late 1990s with Madiba as president, that there was a different approach to policy, which then over time changed and resulted, unfortunately, in this horrible state capture, this self-serving mentality, which then is indeed the reference point to say enough is enough. Don't continue and pretend you have liberated the people while you use the credits to continue to exploit the people. And that's the moment we are now having in South Africa, where the ANC might have the chance to reinvent itself as a modern new party.
And if they are able to do that as well, Professor, would they have made history? They would have been one of the first few to be able to do that.
That's what I hope. And as the saying is, hope dies last. I very much hope that the ANC is able to use this specific constellation to set an example, not only for South Africa, but for the rest of the continent.
Yeah. You know, you spoke of state capture as well, and there's also a tendency sometimes by liberation movements who come into government to kind of conflate the powers that be between state, the party and the government, and that there's almost like this equating the party with the government or the state, which is a problem.
It's a problem, and it's again spot on as a diagnosis. It seems you have been very well prepared, or you work on the subject, Martha. It's really the point that this equation is working also in the mind of those who execute political power, that the party is the state, the government, and the government is the state, meaning they are the ones who have access to the public funds. They occupy the empires of state-owned enterprises. They help themselves. They misappropriate taxpayers' money for their own gains. It's a clientelist organization. And so this is indeed the problem. They are not aware that they should be, as a party, accountable and transparent among to the electorate, but also to the institutions. So this is one of the things which plays against that concept which is applied under former liberation movements as governments. But again, Martha, South Africa positively is different from some of the other cases, which are even worse, because South Africa has a very strong civil society, has rule of law, an independent judiciary, and control mechanisms which are lacking in other countries. And these are contributing factors which create this unique situation, which might be to the benefit of political culture, of governance, and the ordinary people.
Professor Melber, I could talk about this with you for hours. Thank you so much for your insights and just having this conversation with us. That is Professor Henning Melber, who is a professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Pretoria.